Hello everyone and welcome to StudyIQ. I'm Dr. Mahipal Rathod and today we have with us a very special guest, Mr. Viral B. Acharya. Actually, Dr. Acharya because he is a PhD and he has been one of the youngest deputy governors of the RBI. I'm sure most of you are well acquainted with him and he has been teaching for the past year at the New York University. He has also taught earlier at the London School of Business and he is one of the most noted economists of India. Dr. Viral, welcome to StudyIQ.
Thank you, Dr. Rathod. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to interact virtually with your budding IAS aspirants. And I hope that some of the communication and conversations we have will be useful for them in some way, both for their exams as well as down the line as they embark on their careers in the bureaucracy.
Dr. Viral has recently penned a book. It's called Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India. Now, we will be talking about this book and we'll be asking him some questions regarding the Indian economy. And I'm sure his answers will provide a lot of insights for the aspirant community out there watching this and even for the layman who is watching this interview. So, sir, I would like to start our talk with the Monetary Policy Committee. The MPC was formed about 4 years ago and you were a part of it for a very long time when you were at the RBI. Do you think that the MPC has served its purpose?
That's a great question to start, especially as you said, because the first Monetary Policy Committee has finished its 4 years. Let me just walk you through a little bit as to why India adopted the inflation targeting framework and the Monetary Policy Committee approach. As I've explained at several times in my book, both in the preface chapter as well as in the speeches on monetary policy pass-through, that the reason why central banks are given the focus of price stability or inflation stability is because when inflation runs away to very rapidly high levels, it can lead to a financial crisis, because when interest rates rise, a lot of bonds and other instruments will lose value, hitting the balance sheets of banks. It can lead to loss of confidence in the economy's ability to generate growth in the long run, because external investors who have invested their dollars into the economy will now realize that the currency is going to depreciate because the real value of what can be purchased with the currency is degrading when inflation rises. And therefore, they will want to pull their dollars out before the exchange rate actually gets further worse for converting, say, rupees into dollars. So it can lead to an external sector crisis, not just a hit on the banks and a banking crisis, but it can lead to an external sector crisis. And third, and perhaps least appreciated, is the fact that when inflation rises, savers in the economy switch to real assets, such as investing in housing, gold. And, at the very extreme, Serbia, which recorded one of the highest ever daily inflation rates during the wars of 90s, essentially people were owning just food and other commodities, because you switch to a barter system because the money no longer has its value. As someone jokingly put it, it's better to pay the cab driver when you enter the taxi rather than to wait to pay until your ride has ended, because money would have lost its value by the time the journey came to an end. So then it essentially completely breaks down the financial machinery and the lubricating value of the money. And, it can lead to a very spiral downward. So in India, we had witnessed such an episode, not as extreme, but we were at double-digit inflation levels. In 2013, we were hit by a taper tantrum when the US Federal Reserve hinted that it might be raising its interest rates and ending the quantitative easing after the global financial crisis. Basically, India's macros were not right. We had large fiscal deficit, we had double-digit inflation, and we essentially had a mini storm on hands in the summer of 2013. I think the Indian rupee depreciated by more than 25% within a period of 3 to 4 months. So what was the problem then? The problem was that domestic and international investors' expectations were not anchored that the central bank will not allow the inflation to run away. Now, why was that? Because we did not have a very clear mandate for the central bank that it needs to actually keep inflation at bay. So when Governor Rajan started his term in September 2015, he already said in his very early speeches that we will move towards a flexible inflation targeting framework. Inflation that time was still pretty high. So the goal was to try and bring it down, in part with government's efforts on food management, and in part through the central bank very vocally speaking and telling everyone that no, we are focused on keeping inflation down. And that's building credibility through your actions, because you don't just try to keep interest rates low to support growth. If that is associated with an overheating and runaway inflation, then the central bank starts making a trade-off that for the long run, I have to give up some growth in the short run, because if I keep inflation at bay, I won't have a banking sector crisis, an external sector crisis, or savers fleeing away from financial assets. Then the Urjit Patel committee report was put in place. It provided a roadmap as to what could be the architecture of an inflation targeting framework in India. And ultimately, the efforts led to the adoption of flexible inflation targeting framework by the statute. So, an amendment was made to the RBI Act, which essentially enjoined the central bank to maintaining consumer price inflation, so the retail measure of inflation, at 4% with a band of 2% above and below. What is the significance of the band? You cannot always target inflation at a very precise level. And so the band is where errors will be tolerated, so to speak. And if the band is violated for 3 quarters in a row, then the central bank would have to make an explanation to the parliament as to why, what were the factors that led to the inflation target not being met. Now, importantly, it's flexible in the sense that it says that you have to maintain this target inflation rate while paying attention to growth. And the Act also lays out the process. What is the instrument that the central bank has? The instrument is the policy rate, the rate at which the central bank lends to banks against typically government bonds as collateral. And it also says that it will not just be the central bank that makes this call. It will be 3 representatives from the central bank, but 3 externally appointed members. The idea is to get some diversity, but if there is a tie, then the governor has a casting vote. Now, these members have to meet, the minutes are disclosed, and there's a resolution statement which is released before the press conference that takes place. Now, why am I getting into so much details about all this? It's because you can see that this is basically a very democratically accountable institution, the Monetary Policy Committee and the Inflation Targeting Framework. It tells the central bank and the members of the Monetary Policy Committee, what's your objective, what's your policy tool, and how will you demonstrate on an ongoing basis how you're taking decisions. You need to tell me transparently through your minutes, through explanations as to why you didn't meet the target, as to how you are performing your function. And it is this process, it is this institution which builds the credibility in the minds of domestic investors, in the minds of households, in the minds of external investors, that no, the central bank means business. When short-term pressures to growth arise, maybe they could be because of political compulsions, electoral cycles, or maybe even a big shock, that if the growth pressures are coincident with inflation pressures, the central bank will not just sidestep inflation away. It will actually remain focused because it is required by legal mandate to actually stay focused. My assessment is that the framework was very important to put in place. It has done reasonably well. I understand that out of the, 50 odd months under the framework, a large percentage of the months, more than 90% of the months or close to that, inflation has stayed within the band. There have been a few deviations on the downside below 2%. In the last 2 to 3 quarters, inflation, partly because of the supply side COVID pressures, has risen to above 6% level. So we have seen violations on the other side now. And yet you can see that even though growth is weak, at the last Monetary Policy Committee meeting in August, the accommodation was paused. Interest rates were not cut, even though growth has weakened. Why? Because inflation is actually beyond the range that would be considered comfortable given the legal mandate of the Monetary Policy Committee. In fact, the last point, I would recommend an excellent report that's written by Professor Poonam Gupta, Professor Barry Eichengreen, and a co-author. They evaluate the performance of the Monetary Policy Committee. They explain that the committee seems to be making a very nuanced trade-off between inflation and growth. And lastly, there are other metrics one can look at. As I said, external sector stability is a key reason to have the Monetary Policy Committee. And what many observers notice is that the Indian rupee, its exchange rate relative to the dollar, has become quite stable after the efforts to adopt flexible inflation targeting have been taken on. Its volatility is now very, very low compared to other emerging markets such as Indonesia. And one of the reasons that is attributed to this is not just the fact that the central bank has a huge war chest of dollar reserves, but is also that there is inflation credibility. Even when inflation rises temporarily, it doesn't cause the exchange rate to depreciate very sharply because the market expects the RBI to take the corrective actions, the MPC to take the corrective actions to bring the inflation back towards the mandated target level. So I would say it's very important to persevere with this institution. You get inflation credibility built not in a few years. You can't just squander away the gains saying, oh, we have tackled inflation, so let's give it up now and let's focus on growth. This is a period of decades. A central bank builds its reputation over long stretches of time. And then you start reaping the full benefits, because then, overall uncertainty in the government bond yield curve comes down. And external sector remains very stable. And once you have that, there is not as much uncertainty. Financial savers don't need to worry excessively about wanting higher returns for investing in long-term assets and so on. So I would say I would give it very high marks, both for institutional design as well as the manner in which it has operated. One last point here, which is that the institution actually explicitly allows the MPC to refuse influences. There's an embargo period of 7 days before and after the MPC meeting, and the MPC members can refuse to talk to anyone, including the government, if they are asked to be spoken to in this time. And so that's how you build credibility. It's by giving an institution of the country a legal mandate, tools, and democratic accountability principles, but then you let it be. You leave it at arm's length and you let it do its function the way it interprets the legal mandate to be.
In your book, you have dedicated many pages to non-performing assets, the problem of NPA. Now, due to the COVID crisis, it is expected that the NPAs will rise. In fact, RBI's report on financial stability itself says that NPAs could rise to 14.7% by March 2021. Do you think this is the perfect time to create a bad bank or a public sector asset rehabilitation agency?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I give a good summary of all this a little bit in the introduction chapter. I also explain this in the very first section of the book, which is on resolution of non-performing assets. And my very first speech as a deputy governor was actually on some ways to decisively resolve the bank distressed assets. Uh, so, see, what has happened, unfortunately, is that the legacy problems are very large. And if you don't resolve them quickly, time doesn't wait for anyone. The economic cycle continues. Shocks like COVID will come and hit. Smaller shocks hit on a more regular basis, and firms do go bankrupt or belly up. And so the stock of assets keeps rising. And so if the legacy stock is never addressed quickly and decisively, you are always playing catch up. The banking sector is never able to focus on growth and loans going forward. It has to devote an excessive amount of resources to dealing with the legacy loans. And worse, they might even throw good money after the bad because they may be not having adequate capital and they want to not recognize the losses because that would cause further erosion of capital, and then they would have to provide for these losses and so on. So clearly, as you said, the Reserve Bank of India's financial stability report is hinting towards 12.5 to 15% ratios of gross non-performing assets on banking sector balance sheets. I think that must be taken very, very seriously. Is it time to set up a bad bank? I used to be quite attracted to this idea before I came to the Reserve Bank of India. Once I came to the Reserve Bank of India, I was of the view that unless all the parts of how a bad bank will work are clearly laid out, it may just end up being another parking space for the bad loans. What I mean by that is that does it really make a difference if a bad loan stays on a bank balance sheet or it moves over into a bad bank? Especially if both are going to be government-owned entities. Government will need to provide capital to absorb the losses one way or the other. If the government gets the loans, bad loans sold from a public sector bank into a bad bank, there will be a price at which this loan is sold. Clearly, it's not going to be 100 paisa on a rupee because there will be some loss on these loans. And so the public sector bank will have to recognize a loss. So that will mean that it will have to be recapitalized by the government one way or the other. So again, it highlights that, at a minimum, the government has to put up substantial capital upfront. So at what price will they get these things sold? So that needs to be sorted out. Second, and importantly, very often we have not had success in creating institutions like this, staffing them well, spelling out their mandates very clearly, and then ensuring that within a few months of setting up, they get going with this. So once I went to RBI, I realized I spoke to several of my students who are actually working in the distressed loan restructuring space, and they said, listen, the government has just created insolvency and bankruptcy code. It is meant to provide time-bound resolution of these non-performing assets. Wouldn't it be better if banks actually used the insolvency and bankruptcy code to resolve these assets? And then through that you create both a precedence as well as experience in how to deal with restructured assets. And so that was the route that we took at RBI. And so whether a bad bank should be created or not, I think it can be created. It will require capital upfront, both for itself as well as for losses that banks will incur when loans are sold to the bad bank. These assets will still have to be resolved. Right now, the bankruptcy code is not functioning except for the cases that were filed prior to the outbreak of COVID. So, of course, new cases can't be filed, but perhaps those cases which are already in IBC can still be resolved. And third, the question you have to ask is, how are we going to manage it? Do we need the management to be with the government? or for certain kinds of assets, can the management essentially be private? So in my February 2017 speech, I had suggested two kinds of structures. One was a private asset management vehicle, which you could deal with sectors like in steel, textiles, chemicals, etc. And the other was a national asset management company to deal with sectors like power assets, where perhaps you might have excess capacity, but you can't just liquidate these assets. Maybe you have to mothball them and keep them quarantined for a while until the power demand consumption in the economy rises to the levels that all of these power thermal plants can be operated. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that it's not a matter of saying we need or don't need a bad bank. I think what we need is a blueprint which lays out the exact architecture of how it's going to work and how will the prices at which loans are transferred to the bad bank are decided. Where is the capital going to come from? Who's going to manage these assets? Is it going to be private asset managers, or government is going to hire some people to manage these? In what time are we going to set this up? And importantly, how does all this mesh with the parallel infrastructure we have created, which is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code? Just another word of caution, which is that one joke that is sometimes made is that maybe some certain banks we have, like IDBI Bank or some asset restructuring companies that we have, maybe that these are already like parking spots for bad loans. When you have all your portfolio in distressed loans, or in case of IDBI, like 25 to 35% of asset portfolio is in bad loans, that's already like a bad bank. So one question that gets asked is, why do you need another bad bank? And so I think what I'm trying to say is that we really need to ask and answer the question, what purpose will this bad bank serve? Is it to clean up the existing banks from their bad loans? Is it also to resolve the distress of the underlying companies? If it is to clean up the existing banks, will capital be put into them so that once cleaned up, they can start lending in a healthy way to the rest of the economy? And who is going to do the asset resolution on the underlying companies? Do we need a private asset management company, or do we need a national asset management company? So I by revealed preference, during my term, we went down the path of requiring banks to file cases to the IBC and getting them resolved in a time-bound manner. But we seem to have slowed down in the pace at which cases are being resolved. And at least in my view, perhaps we should not have shut down the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code post-COVID. We could have still made it available as a restructuring mechanism, but allowed perhaps the existing borrowers who filed for bankruptcy during COVID to have a chance at retaining the firm if their creditors also agree to do that. Because you can't create an Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code and then start designing parallel systems to resolve the bad assets, because you have to have a legal framework under which these are done. If you don't do it under a legal framework, then the banking regulator, the RBI, has to start designing restructuring packages, and you don't get the richness of outcomes that you would get out of an Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code in that. Even a bigger pragmatic issue is that a banking regulator can design rules that apply to its regulated entities, but mutual funds, insurance companies, who also provide bonds and other kinds of debt to companies, they are subjected to Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, but clearly RBI's restructuring packages don't carry over to them unless SEBI, IRDA, and all the other regulators also join forces with them. So I think it's a very complex question. The problem is very large, and my preference would be that we continue to use Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code for timely resolution. We look for out-of-court restructuring packages wherever feasible. But ideally, if you do that, you need to find ways of bringing banks, insurance companies, mutual funds, all to the table so that resolution can take place. And third, if we go down the path of a bad bank or asset management companies, as I called in my Feb 2017 speech, then we need a very clear blueprint as to how this is going to happen, how it's going to be financed, and how we can make it work quickly.
Since you mentioned complex questions, I think people like you are most qualified to answer complex questions like this. Everyone in India looks up to economists such as you for answers to these questions. So my next question.
We are trying to figure out some sort of a path forward. Of course, as I said, I had laid it out in the February 2017 speech.
Yes.
Then we went down the path of directing cases to insolvency and bankruptcy court, but that has hit some roadblocks and delays, as we discussed.
You have talked about reorienting the government expenditure from revenue to capital account. But as we know, the burden of salaries and pensions is continuously growing. So how do you think that reorientation can be done? What is the path?
Yeah, that's a very good detailed question. Just to give a little bit of perspective on this, essentially what I'm saying in my preface chapter of the book, which is a very extensive introduction called Fiscal Dominance, a Theory of Everything in India. What I'm trying to say is that the initial conditions are now such that fiscally the government is very stretched on its expenditures. Tax collections are coming down because growth is slowing. And so invariably it is turning to various regulators, notably the central bank, to choose a set of rules so that its borrowing can be easy to roll over. Banks can be given breaks rather than being very strong to continue to lend even when capital levels are not necessarily high. Delay the recognition of losses, resolution of bad loans and things like that. And I call this fiscal dominance because the fiscal pressure start dominating the policies of the central bank. So one of the recommendations, as you point out, I have made is that while the central bank should remain focused on financial stability and not get that easily dominated, the fiscal authorities can also manage the fiscal side a bit better to reduce these pressures of dominance that can lead to financial instability and so on. So my view on reorienting the capital expenditure, reorienting the expenditures away from revenues towards capital is I would say twofold. One, we have a lot of subsidies that are being provided in the revenue expenditures. Many of the revenue expenditure gets marketed as ultimately reaching the end farmer or the end consumer. But very often the expenditures are incurred simply in the implementation of the subsidy. If you think about the food grains management by the government, the food grains have to be stored for a period of time. So how much of the money goes simply in generating funds and then paying interest on them for actually having the storage capacity, procuring the grains and so on? Can we really say that all of that is actually in the end reaching the consumer who received the food grains in the end? Similarly, if you think about fertilizer subsidies, how much of this is actually reaching what size farmer? Essentially, evidence is that while we have reduced on the leakages in our subsidies, that the leakages are very substantial, and that it might be better to use the impressive investments we have made in Aadhaar and Jan Dhan Yojana accounts to make direct benefit transfers to individuals and let them decide how they want to spend that money, rather than actually government getting into complex implementations of how to actually deliver these subsidies. So if we adopted some kind of a universal basic income as an alternative to several of these subsidies, there may be some efficiency gains and an ability to compress the expenditure on revenue side, because you are not having to incur so many of the side costs of running financing operations, storage operations, etc., in order to run these things. That would free up space for capital expenditures. The second point that you mentioned more explicitly is, of course, the issue of pensions and salaries. Some of this can't be done away with, I fully agree. But here also there is an alternative, which is that the reason why the pensions and the salary bills are very high is because the government has continued to be a very large presence in several sectors through owning state-owned enterprises, both at the center as well as at the state level. And I'm pushing in the preface chapter quite heavily for the government to undertake a substantial divestment program of the manner that was undertaken in 90s and early parts of 2000s, so that many of these labor compensation issues, rather than becoming a government borrowing burden, are actually transferred to the private sector and let the private sector deal with it, let them acquire majority stakes, maybe even full reprivatization in some cases. Because I think the question we have to ask is whether the cost being incurred by the government in maintaining these salaries is an efficient use of overall funds available in the economy. Would the operations of these enterprises be more efficient if instead of the government borrowing the money, a private sector actually raised the money? It changed the way the compensation practices are. It changed the way the hiring practices are, the labor contracts are, and made the enterprise bigger. And as a result of that, it actually improved the overall efficiency of capital in the economy. So I think right now, sometimes when we view government expenditures, we take a very narrow view that, because an expenditure is there, it cannot be touched. It cannot really be moved anywhere else. But that is not the right economic question to ask. The right economic question to ask is, if we move that expenditure from government's balance sheet to the private sector through a divestment, would we unlock value? Would we unlock economic value in the process? Would the productivity of that firm get enhanced? Will it get more contracts? Can it become a global player and attract more financing as a result of that? And then once you start doing these calculations, you could very easily reach the conclusion that in many sectors which are non-strategic and which are not like public goods like health, education, or infrastructure, maybe the government doesn't need to take on such a huge salary and pensions bill. Maybe let it go to the private sector, because you will unlock value. And so the burden would not be as high on the system from having these compensation expenses.
So what is your view on the fiscal deficit for the current financial year? Also, what do you think should be the maximum limit for fiscal deficit? And should India borrow more from outside the country, because borrowing from inside will lead to crowding out effect?
Yeah, there are no easy answers here. I think the estimates of fiscal deficit for the year consolidated are probably already in the 10 to 15% range. It'll depend very heavily on the revenue collections, especially in the short run. And because additional expenditures would have to be undertaken in order to deal with the pandemic management, as well as relief efforts that have to be provided to states and the citizenry who are most affected. So, there are estimates by analysts out there that one could look at. I think they've done a more careful job than I can probably provide. What is the maximum level? There's no such thing as a maximum level, but we are clearly in the high fiscal deficit category. And I think the key point here is that this deficit is not going up just because of COVID. Our deficits have been slipping even before COVID for at least 3 to 4 years in a row. We had an oil price bonanza for a couple of years when prices crashed. But, we don't seem to have retained the consolidation gains from there, because more expenditures seem to have been undertaken. So the growth has been slipping, fiscal deficit has been rising, government borrowing programs are increasing in size, and it is this combination that is not right. Because see, if your growth is rising and your fiscal deficit is increasing, but the growth is actually providing more then your deficits are rising, then your debt to GDP ratios won't increase, because the GDP is growing at a faster pace than your debt numbers are growing at a rate. Right now, we have the situation that growth is going to be declining, and unfortunately, the deficit and the borrowing are going to be on a rise. The projections are that we could possibly be hitting 80 to 90% debt to GDP ratios very soon. I think these are not comfortable ratios. These are very close to the thresholds that noted economists Reinhardt and Rogoff identified, that once government debt to GDP starts exceeding 90%, 95% debt to GDP, the crowding out effects that you mentioned start kicking in and the growth actually slows down. Should the borrowings move to the external sector? It depends on what your growth path is. See, if inflation is kept at bay and if growth is resuscitated to be on a better path, then it will be comfortable to borrow on the external sector. But if you are not doing that and you are going and borrowing more abroad, then of course you are exposing the country to far more external indebtedness, and this could turn out to be a problem. It would increase the external sector risk. So I would say the first and foremost question that we need to ask is, can we do consolidation? Can we avoid wasteful expenditures on the government front? Can we undertake a substantial divestment program to reduce the reliance on borrowings? I would first try to do all of this rather than adding to the external sector vulnerability by increasing government borrowings even more on the external front. And third, and most importantly, are we putting growth back on track? Besides fiscal and financial stability, perhaps we need to think hard about the course of the real economy, what kind of land, labor, and agricultural reforms we need. And maybe this is the moment to actually do another round of 1991 style transformational structural reforms, so that we give commitment to markets and rating agencies that, yes, our debt numbers are rising, but our growth trajectory is being actually put on an even faster path so that the debt to GDP numbers can come back in time rather than continue to keep rising.
Recently, in the RBI annual report, it was reported that there has been a huge jump in bank fraud. What is your take on this, on the problem of bank fraud in India?
I think it's very massive. It's very unfortunate. I think, essentially, as my former colleague N.S. Vishwanathan wrote in one of his speeches, he was a fellow deputy governor, as you know, in 2018, he basically said that the Indian debt contract looks like an equity contract. It almost looks like the creditor has very weak rights. The money gets siphoned off. The due diligence and monitoring that banks should be doing on the borrowers after the loans are made is simply not there. The hope is that you make a loan, hopefully it pays off. If it doesn't pay off, then you turn to the regulator and then you say, oh, listen, I can't absorb these losses. Because if I absorb the losses, I won't be able to lend. If I absorb the loss, the government has to put in more capital. And so the bank regulatory function then is constantly under a fiscal dominance pressure, as I was saying. What is interesting is that many of the frauds are actually in very large ticket loans. There is very little enforcement and other kinds of actions that are happening at a fast pace. Maybe it's very complex, the way the frauds take place, and therefore quick actions are not possible. And as a result, what is happening is that there's essentially a lot of siphoning of the taxpayer money that's taking place through this. And therefore, we were very clear when we were at RBI that you need a fast track resolution of bad loans. And you need better incentives to monitor at public sector banks in order to get them to do this job better. I think the question that I'm again asking, similar to the salaries and payments question, is does the government need to own so many banks? Maybe it's time to reprivatize some of the healthier public sector banks, let them get private capital, let them be held more accountable to the markets. Maybe they will become more efficient in their operations, do better risk management, adopt technology in a better way. And maybe some of the weaker public sector banks can be reprioritized to perform the more focused financial inclusion functions, similar to small finance banks or microcredit institutions, and perhaps they could be reprivatized once their quality, governance, underwriting, monitoring of loans, etc. improves. So I think the fraud numbers are extremely disappointing. They are a sign that there is something fundamentally wrong with the model of banking, especially the public sector banking. And we really need to rethink whether the decision that was taken 40, 50 years back in 60s and 70s to nationalize these banks has really paid off for the economy or not.
In one of the chapters, that is one of your speeches, you say that there is a need for RBI to have true independence. Uh, isn't RBI an autonomous body already? What kind of autonomy, what more autonomy do you think that RBI requires?
Yeah, see, so this is, of course, the Eddie Stroff Memorial Lecture where I wrote about the central bank as an independent regulatory institution. And the book, my book, Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India, has a really masterful foreword by Dr. Y.V. Reddy, the former governor of the RBI, that I recommend very highly. He says it very clearly that the letter of the law, the RBI Act, is one of the weakest in the world in terms of the autonomy it grants the Reserve Bank, the central bank. Nevertheless, at many points of time, things were okay because in 70s and 80s, we didn't have a private economy. So he very nicely puts it that the government, the central bank, and the public sector banks were basically this Hindu undivided family in which no one kept anyone's accounts. But that's not so anymore. We have a private banking sector. We have a large private non-financial sector. We need it to generate high growth that we want. And so over time, the central bank has focused on developing markets, developing non-bank parts of the financial sector, ensuring that credit is not just going to the government and government-owned enterprises, but also has left some space for going to the private sector of the economy. But as growth has slowed, as the savings rate in the economy is coming down, and as the fiscal deficits are rising, once again, the pressure to go back to 70s, 80s style arrangement of fiscal dominance of the central bank are rising again. So how do we ensure that even if the independence is not in the letter of the law, it is there in practice? Of course, one way is for the central bank to be aware of the dangers of fiscal dominance. As I mentioned, it can lead to runaway inflation that can cause domestic banking crises, external sector fragility. It can lead to poor outcomes for banks and lead to loss of depositor confidence in the banks as well. And so the central bank has to put financial stability and external sector stability as a long-term objective first and foremost when it is under pressure from the government. But ultimately, we do need to strengthen the letter of the law. In the preface chapter, I provide several examples. I suggest that the top management be appointed for a term that spans the term of the current government. Top management should not be, the government should not have the option to fire them without any cause and due process. The same way, appointments of the board members of RBI should also be subject to a public consultation and a parliamentary process, as it is there in many parts of the world. Second, besides the appointments and so on, the second important point is that when banks were nationalized to become public sector banks, the Bank Nationalization Act overrides the certain powers of the Reserve Bank of India in dealing with these banks. So, management powers are all with the Department of Financial Services, so with the Finance Ministry. And of course, the central bank cannot, in a prompt corrective action, if a public sector bank is underperforming, it can't just sell the equity stake because the stake is actually belonging to the government. So the central bank can't engineer a takeover by a healthy balance sheet of a public sector bank. So it leads to dual control. And this needs to be relaxed. Essentially, RBI should have exactly the same powers over public sector banks so that regulation is made ownership neutral. And third, I would say a lot can be learned from the benefits of the flexible inflation targeting framework that I described in response to your very first question. In essence, through a simple amendment, we created a legal institution which has a clear mandate, a clear instrument, and democratic accountability of the process. In my view, this similar kind of process, an institutionalized process, needs to be created on bank supervision and regulation, so that RBI does a lot of rule-based decision making and is democratically accountable through reports and whenever it makes discretion. So whenever it makes exceptions like giving forbearances, they should be documented. What is the need for this? What is the sunset clause? For how long? What are the intended and unintended consequences, etc. And I think that would actually reduce the extent of fiscal dominance on the central bank, and it would make the central bank more autonomous. So if I could just stress one point here, the point of the A.D. Shroff Memorial Lecture is that when economic historians have studied countries and asked the question, which countries grow well for a sustainable period of time, the question they always ask is, oh, how can a country reach the standard of living that Denmark has? And what they've documented is that it's not about individuals, it's about quality of the institutions in a country. Do you have rule of law? Is it enforced? Do you have systems, so the judiciary and the bankruptcy code, etc., to enforce contracts? Do they function well? Is there ease of doing business on the ground, which leads to creation of new firms and destruction of underperforming firms? And my point in the A.D. Shroff Memorial Lecture is that a central bank should be considered as an important such institution. Just the way we agree the judiciary, the election commission, the bankruptcy court should not be under the influence of the government by law, the same way we need to create a stronger independence for the central bank, both by law as well as in practice. Ideas I mentioned about management, appointment, owned or not, the central bank should have the same rules. And thirdly, more rule-based decision-making rather than discretion-based decision-making, and with reports whenever exceptions are made, especially in bank regulation and supervision. These are three ways in which the effective independence of the central bank, both in the letter of the law and in practice, can be strengthened going forward.
Okay. On a related note, how do you see the relationship of RBI and the government in the past 6 years during the NDA regime?
I don't want to comment on a specific government in particular, but Dr. Reddy explains it in his chapter in the book, the foreword of the book, that the problems between governments and central banks have always been there. There have been disagreements, there have been pressures. The question is whether the initial conditions are such that in the end, the central bank is allowed to remain at arm's length, or that the central bank was in line with the government through pressure, but it didn't matter too much for the economy because we were a 70s, 80s centralized, nationalized economy. What I'm stressing in the preface chapter is that now our initial conditions are not great. Our fiscal deficits are rising. Our growth is slowing down. The savings rate in the economy is coming down. And unfortunately, even with those initial conditions, now we have a COVID shock to deal with. What that means is that the fiscal dominance pressures are going to rise. And if we don't keep them at bay, we could be risking financial instability because we will allow bank regulation to be compromised. We will distract the central bank away from maintaining inflation stability. And we could result in a greater and greater crowding out of the private sector, which will take us back to the nationalized, centralized era of 3%, the so-called Hindu rate of growth. And that's just not good enough for the demographics, the poverty, and the aspirations that the youth in the country have. So I would say that we are at a very important crossroads for the economy as to the direction that we take. Do these initial conditions make the economy more centralized, nationalized economy where private sector keeps getting crowded out? Or do we actually undertake institutional reforms on fiscal side? Do we undertake institutional reforms on the financial side? And do we undertake transformational reforms on for structural changes in our growth model on land, labor, and agriculture to make this happen? I think that will depend on the policy choices that the country makes going forward. On fiscal institutional reform, I provide a detailed roadmap. I talk about bipartisan independent fiscal council so that the government can improve the adherence to the fiscal deficit targets set in the FRBM Act. Now, this requires a legislative change, but that is an institution. If you created a bipartisan fiscal council that vets every single budget of the government and its assumptions before the budget is announced and says, listen, if you don't agree with my assumptions on what your deficit numbers are and what they are likely to be, if you don't agree with my assumptions on what is reasonable growth to expect, you need to explain to the people when the budget is announced as to why you have differed from the assumptions of the council in stating the budget. Now, that's the kind of democratic processes and institutions that we need in order to become a great nation, in my view, because that would prevent excesses and short-term pressures from doing permanent damage to the growth path of the economy.
As we record this session today, the GDP data for the first quarter was just released, and the economy, the GDP has shrunk by 23.9% in the first quarter, obviously due to the COVID-19 scenario. So what do you think will be the recovery time for India's GDP? Earlier, the government had a target of $5 trillion economy by 2025. So do you think that goalpost has now shifted? And if yes, what according to you will be the year when India achieves that target now?
It's not surprising at one level, even though it's very painful to see that the contraction is so sharp. And it really goes to show that the health curve is very important to contain. What happens is that even if lockdowns are lifted and containment measures are relaxed, people will not spend on their own. They will not be that comfortable going out. When I speak to my friends in Mumbai, many of them have not left their apartment complexes for 5 months. So the discretionary expenditures, and this is a very interesting statistic the world over, which is that, see, the poor by and large have only essential expenditures. So a part of the economic activity and jobs get created because those who can afford are actually undertaking non-essential expenditures or discretionary expenditures. And it is these discretionary expenditures which are actually collapsing very sharply in different parts of the world affected by the pandemic. And in India, we are seeing something similar as well. So I think we still don't have a sign that the health curve has actually peaked. It still continues to rise. It shows a few days, it will show some signs of stabilizing, but again, we get numbers very soon after which seem to be showing that things are moving ahead. So my sense is, unfortunately, the pandemic will result in a substantial cutback on these discretionary expenditures. It will lead to loss of jobs and collapse of activity. We also have to factor in that many firms and individuals and families and small businesses that are working on borrowed monies will actually need to restructure their debts. They will not be able to pay everything that they borrowed because it's like a one-time 25% loss of revenues in a year. That's just massive. And so, out of court restructuring, resolutions through IBC, if it can be reopened with some adjustments, etc., would be important so that we are not coming out of the pandemic, say, in 12 months' time with a very heavily leveraged, over-borrowed economy relative to its capacity to repay. And third, all of this will also mean losses for banks. And so when the recovery takes place, Banks need to be in a healthy shape to lend to the productive parts of the economy. But if they are again going to be laden with a legacy problem of large losses, then they will not be able to provide that multiplier to the economy either. So to deal with that, we really need that banks raise capital on a war footing to get out of this. Well, the long and short of this is, can we convert what is a very difficult situation into an opportunity? I am still hopeful that we can. As I spell out in the book, on two fronts, we need fiscal institutional reforms so that in the short term, government can undertake necessary relief measures while maintaining medium term credibility with rating agencies, investors, and markets. I give some proposals for that. The key ones being the fiscal council for better adherence, a very substantial divestment program, and the reorientation of expenditures towards infrastructure. We need second financial stability reforms. We discussed some of the ways that RBI's autonomy can be strengthened. We need to recapitalize banks on a war footing, in my view, get them to raise capital in the presently relatively benign equity market conditions. And the central bank has to lean against the winds of fiscal dominance and put its long-term mandates of protecting depositors, guarding against inflation, keeping external sector stable as its first and foremost objectives. Third, I touched less upon this in the book because the book is more on financial stability, but we do need to figure out a better engine for our real sector growth. I think of the economy like a car. It has four wheels: the private sector, the government, the markets, and the central bank. And all of these need to move in sync and at a good, they all need to perform their own functions, but one can't start dominating the other. You can't have a car that's being just driven by front wheels or the back wheels or by just one side of or just one wheel. You need to strike the right balance. And I think this is the essence of the last two essays in my book, the A.D. Stroff Memorial Lecture and the essay on crowding out, that the government needs to undertake reforms and enable the private sector and the markets to function and grow, rather than trying to do too much on its own, ending up with too much borrowing and then trying to dominate everyone else in the economy. But we do need the land, labor, agri reforms. It would be better at this stage to undertake structural reforms and enable others to grow, rather than for the government to try and do everything by itself because it is already overstretched. So I do think it is an opportunity, because sometimes politics and economics aligns the best when there is a crisis styles scenario. We are not in a crisis, but a 24% collapse of economic activity is not something that can be taken very, very lightly. Just last point, I think this idea that somehow when we come out of COVID, there will be no stresses, etc. I think that's kind of it's an overly optimistic way of thinking about things. There will be some long-term scars. People would have lost jobs. Companies would have overstretched balance sheets in some cases. Certain most affected sectors because of the pandemic, especially in services, will take some while to come back up. Boeing, for example, says that it doesn't expect overall air travel to revert back to pre-COVID until 2023. So, we are talking about a fairly uncertain path. We are talking about substantial risks to growth. We have to counter that, in my view, by undertaking institutional reforms on fiscal, financial, and real side of the economy. We can't just take the view that we just have to lend and spend our way out of this without actually addressing the fact that our initial parameters were getting worse for 3 years, even coming into COVID. So this is not just a COVID problem that we can just spend our way out of, like some of the rich countries are trying to do at this point. So let me stop there, Dr. Rathore, and all the best to all the aspirants for the IAS exam. I've never taken it myself, but I know of friends who have taken the exam. I know it's very tough and requires a lot of preparation. So all the very best to all of you, and also the very best for health and safety of your families during this difficult time.
So thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
And there's just one last question which is unrelated to economy. I read somewhere that you also have an album, Yadon Ke Silsile, that you composed and have sung songs for. How did that come about? An economist in this.
Yeah, actually, I didn't sing in that. I do like to sing, and I used to sing on stage at some point. We had a band at NYU called Sur Bahar, inspired by our IIT band Sur Bahar. I wanted to. I like writing lyrics and composing poetry. Every now and then I do it. So my wife encouraged at some point, along with some other friends who are also doing compositions of their own, that maybe I should try to do something. So I recorded this album in Pune. Two of these Saregama and Saregama winners in the very early editions, Rishikesh Ranade and Prajakta Joshi, they sang the male and the female songs. I wrote the tunes and the lyrics, and the arrangement was done in studio by a person called Narendra Pide in Pune. It was just for fun. I had a great time. I learned a lot. I think some of the early songs, the songs that were recorded late, which appear as the first songs in the album, you can see they are better than the songs that come later on, because it was a very steep learning curve for me to figure out how to get the recording, etc. Right? It's an album that's it's out there on YouTube. People listen to it sometimes. Once in a while, I go back to listen to it, and I say, "Oh yeah, did I write that?" But no, it's just a hobby. Music gives me a lot of peace of mind. I'm a big fan of Bollywood music of 70s and 80s, especially even 50s and 60s. But I like the Kishore Kumar, S.D. Burman, R.D. Burman combo especially a lot. It's something to cross-train your mind with. I'm always looking for songs that can best describe situations in the financial sector, because it makes for a good communication and building a rapport with the audience when you do that. But no, these things happen in spurts. I wrote my speeches. I wrote this introduction chapter. I bound it together. It's out there now. One interesting thing, if I could mention, both for that album as well as for this book, my share of proceeds are actually going to a charity called Pratham in India. It does work for education of underprivileged children and for skilling of youth. It's a 25-year-old charity. It reaches out to millions of children. In fact, it has reached out to several million children even during the COVID outbreak by using the digital content that it has developed. In some parts of the country, it has been delivered through radio, because that's the only way you can reach the children and keep their minds stimulated. So I very much hope that even regardless of whether you buy and read the book or not, that you take an interest in some cause like this outside of your immediate passions and jobs, because I think it's good to constantly remind yourself that we have to ultimately try and make the system in such a way that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. And so if you have time, take a look at Pratham's work. And I think it's doing some very interesting things. So are so many other NGOs in the country. So yeah.
Definitely, I would urge all our viewers to go through the book, purchase it. You can purchase the book via Amazon. You can also buy an e-copy, read it on Kindle. It's a fabulous read. It's a collection of all the speeches and all the speeches that Mr. Viral Acharya has delivered. So it's a fantastic read. And thank you so much, Dr. Acharya, for taking out the time for us out of your busy schedule and giving us this opportunity to bring you over at StudyIQ. Thank you so much.
Sure, Dr. Rathore. Thank you for the opportunity. All the best.